when Constantine became a Christian, everything went bad because he gave Christians power, he forced Christianity on everyone, and that's where the church lost its real soul and its gospel focus. That simply isn't true, and the sources will not permit that.
Well, hey everyone, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin, and this is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we seek to bring simplicity out of theological complexity. Today, I've got an interview for you with Dr. John Dickson. He's an ancient historian and church scholar, theologian, great guy, super articulate, and we're talking about how to make sense of both the beauties and just the really difficult parts of church history, talking about his book, Bullies and Saints. I think you're really going to enjoy it. I know a lot of the people that come to this channel love historical theology, and this will be right up your alley, but also help you kind of get out of just the inside baseball of historical theology and wrestle through maybe how people on the outside are looking at church history and how do we have a response for what has happened, not necessarily always jumping to defend the church or individuals on everything, but also not jumping ship and recognizing that we stand in this long line of the church and that we do believe in this one holy Catholic and apostolic church. Well, I hope you enjoy it and we'll get right to it. But first, I want to say a huge thanks to my Patreon subscribers and merch buyers who make this channel possible, especially to my patrons. Y'all won't see this because you watch these videos ad-free and you watch them early, but I do appreciate you all so much. And if you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity, or if you don't want to sign up for a subscription, you can go to paypal.me/gospelsimplicity if you'd like to make a one-time donation. Seriously, thank you all so much for supporting this channel. It helps this channel continue to go and grow, reach more people, and allow it to continue to be sustainable. So it means the world to me. Thank you all so much. With all that being said, I hope you all enjoy the video. Well, today I am joined by Dr. John Dickson. Dr. John Dickson thinks, writes, and speaks. Starting out as a singer-songwriter, he now works as an author, academic, and media presenter. In 2007, he co-founded, with Dr. Greg Clark, the Center for Public Christianity and has published 18 books and 3 TV documentaries. He teaches historical Jesus at the University of Sydney and is a visiting academic in the Faculty of Classics at the University of Oxford. In 2019, he was appointed Distinguished Fellow and Senior Lecturer in Public Christianity at Ridley College in Melbourne, I suppose I should say. In all that he does, whether in the media or the church, creative or academic, he strives to be a public advocate for the Christian faith. His podcast, Undeception, seeks to promote clarity about Christianity in doubting times. Having lost his father in a plane crash at 9, John is sympathetic to the sorrows and questions of our world and values his wife and 3 children above all other gifts of this life. Dr. Dickson, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's been a while since I've had someone read that back to me.
It is always strange, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, but yeah, I'm delighted to have you here. Today we're going to be talking a bit about your, I believe it's your most recent book, Bullies and Saints. Is that correct?
Yeah,
it's most recent?
just came out a few months ago. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, I saw you've got like over 18 titles out, so you never know what's the most recent, but I knew it was very recent. So yeah, it was a great book. I really enjoyed reading it. And in it, you wrestle through some of the heavy moments and some of the brilliant moments of church history, and how do we make sense of all of that? And so that's a bit of what we're going to be talking about today. And I just want to ask, to start off, what inspired you to write on this topic?
I feel like replying therapy. Knowing a bit about church history, I think any Christian's going to sort of puzzle through, how did that happen? The dark side of stuff. But if I'm honest, the main reason is there is an increasing skepticism from general society that revolves around not so much questions of, does God exist? Is the Bible true, etc., but more around the goodness of the movement we call Christianity. A worry out there in society that really, if the church is too big or too powerful, it really will crush the human spirit, crush creativity, crush the vulnerable, insist on its dogma, and so on. And you see this fear everywhere in popular culture, but also in academic culture. And I felt the only way to address this is not with a kind of knee-jerk apologetics, saying, look at all the good things, but an honest account of history that the skeptic would recognize as honest about the failings, but that also was honest about the incredible gifts of Christianity to Western culture and continuing today. So that's what I'm trying to do, mainly for the skeptic. A lot of my books have been for the people who doubt, not for the people who believe, and this is no exception.
Yeah, I really appreciate that angle to your book, and I think you're spot on as far as having your finger on the pulse of the questions our world is asking. Not even so much, is this true, but is this good? And would I even want this to be true? And if I wouldn't, why should I care if it is? And I think that we ignore that question at times to our detriment. So I really appreciate what you're doing in this book. And if people heard that bio, they know you're not new at all to researching Christianity, in researching the history of Christianity, quite the pedigree there. But was there anything that in working on this project surprised you or jumped out for you?
Many things. On the bad side of the ledger, I'd never actually read in its entirety Martin Luther's mature book, 1543, The Jews and Their Lies. I mean, I had read snippets of it, I knew about it, but avoided it because Martin Luther's my theological hero. But for this book, I actually read the book that Luther wrote, and it is disgusting. It is racist, anti-Semitic in the extreme. And so that was confronting on the dark side of the ledger. On the positive side of the ledger, I was surprised when I did a drill down on ancient catechism. So what did the early church do to school new converts? And already in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, and this is the period where Christianity is not in the majority, pagans are still the majority. For certainly the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity was oppressed periodically by the Roman Empire. They schooled their converts, many of whom were lower class converts, in the most extreme curriculum. So we know that it required about 144 hours of schooling before they would baptize you. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that. There should be no obstacle to such things. But they had learnt the hard way that unless a convert is schooled in the scriptures, in philosophy, in the Christian tradition, and how these things are an answer to pagan worship and Jewish worship, then they would lose converts when it became difficult. So the ancient Christians had this catechetical system, I guess like our adult Sunday school, that schooled even lower class people. And I was blown away by the methodology and by the content, because some of the catechetical lectures have survived, and they are complex and profoundly biblical. So this was a delight. The caricature of the ancient Christian as sort of a novice idiot, who believed silly things because they didn't know better, just can't be sustained.
Yeah, I mean, that's more hours than the average undergraduate degree, I believe, as far as if you counted in credit hours, which is remarkable. And
Yeah.
it is such an interesting thing to look at. And on the flip side, I absolutely agree. Taking a class on the Holocaust this semester and reading that work by Martin Luther is, I think we can all say, as you said, disgusting. And I think what I appreciate about your book is that you don't hide from those parts of the Christian tradition and the Christian history, because the world's not turning a blind eye to these things. And we have to be able to not defend this. I think it's indefensible, but have some type of answer to how do we make sense of these things. And so I really appreciated that. And I loved how you started the book by talking about your own struggles to make sense of the evils that have been perpetrated by the church, but while also confessing your belief, as we say in the Nicene Creed, in the one holy Catholic and apostolic church, and acknowledging that can be difficult to stare these things in the face at time and say, but I believe in this church that Christ built and said the gates of hell would not overcome. And so I imagine in part, your answer to the following question will be, well, this is the whole book. But what advice would you have for people who are tempted to abandon the church? Maybe not Jesus. Maybe they're in that place of, I like Jesus, but man, like, I just don't know I can sign my name behind this thing called church on account of the things that have happened in church history. What would you say to them?
I feel a real affinity with people who conclude that. I guess I'd say, and hopefully without being patronizing, a little bit of knowledge of church history is a dangerous thing, and on both sides of the ledger. So the Christian apologetic approach is normally to know just a little about church history. You just select the really nice bits. You dismiss the bad guys as not real Christians. And a little bit of history, can get by. On the other side of the ledger, there are people who just, for the first time learn that Christians started riots in the ancient world. They killed a famous female philosopher. They tortured people in the 14th century. And if you just learn, you skirt across the top of church history and pluck out those terrible things, and you'll find them in the works of atheists today because they're doing the same thing, a shallow read of church history. You can get to the point where you think, this isn't real. Maybe Jesus was real, but there's nothing genuine and holy in the church. So my answer is read more. Read more history, because a little bit of church history is dangerous, but a lot of church history, I think, is a corrective to the shallow apologist, and is balm to the Christian who feels like giving up because the church just sucks. When you do a deep dive in church history, you'll discover that in every single century, that is no exaggeration, every single century, Christ has left a witness to his beautiful tune for all to hear. If you'll only read the sources, you'll discover the bullies, yes. You'll sometimes discover that the bullies are actually sometimes great saints, but then you'll also discover people and movements that reformed the church in every century. It isn't just the 16th century where there was a Reformation. Every century, God sends some teacher, some prophet to call the church back to its founding documents and to hear the beautiful tune of Jesus, the love of enemy, the giving of the self for others, just as God has done for us. And the church is transformed by it. And when you spot that as the deep golden thread through the whole of church history, I think you can say, I believe in the Holy Catholic Church, or the one apostolic church.
Yeah, and I love how you use that phrase, that beautiful tune. It's something you talk about in your book, and you have this illustration of you can't discount, I forget if it was Beethoven or Bach, on account of, say, you attempting to play it, or me attempting to play it. And likewise, we can't necessarily discount the message of Jesus because his followers carrying out the melody he gave us poorly. And I really appreciate that. I think that's something for people to hold on to. And earlier in that answer, you also mentioned there's this temptation for people to say, you know what, like that, those people, they weren't sincere Christians, and we're just going to write them off when we kind of have this apologetic method. Like they were good Christians, and then everyone who did bad things, well, they just weren't Christians, and so problem solved. And I think likewise in Protestant circles, there can be this temptation, notwithstanding the horrors that have been done by Protestants, not to mention like Martin Luther's book that we talked about, but to say, like, I don't have to claim anything that kind of happened before the Reformation, but yet the reformers themselves wanted to see themselves in continuity with that church reforming it, having lots to say, but they didn't want to say that they were starting something brand new, or that they weren't just as much heirs to Augustine or Chrysostom or any of these guys. And so I'm just curious, like, when we examine these things, I feel like we don't get a pass. And so how do you think about these things? In what sense do Christians kind of bear the weight of these issues? And I know that gets into big complicated cultural conversations too around other things about collective guilt and all of these things, which obviously we can't get to everything, but how do we make sense of this when I see like, hey, I want to claim this person, like you said, of Luther as a theological hero, but what do I do with his anti-Semitism? Or what do I do with these bullies in church history that I don't want to just say, well, I'm not related to them because I stand in line of this one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. What do we do there?
You're certainly right that the reformers didn't see themselves as starting a new church or anything like that. They were reforming the Catholic Church. And Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, they all referred to the Catholic Church, and they thought they were the Catholic Church. They were just the Reformed Catholic Church. When the Protestant Reformation took over Elizabethan England, they were still the Reformed Catholic Church, as the Anglican Church. So that is important to understand. It's not really the spirit of the reformers to say that church history, stops when the Book of Revelation was finished, and then picks up again in 1517 when Luther started his public work. So to be friends of the reformers, we've got to claim it all. And of course, through the whole medieval period, Christians were reading the same New Testament that we're reading today. They were confessing the same creed that mainstream Protestant Christians still declare, the Nicene Creed, and so they were confessing Christ in the same way, and they were starting schools and hospitals and charitable programs and so on. And the Protestant Reformation just continued all of those good things: the creeds, the same New Testament, the churches, the hospitals, the schools. All of that was just what was already in the medieval Catholic Church. So we are just stuck to them empirically. And so we can't skirt around by saying, oh, that was just a Catholic problem. That wasn't a Protestant problem. The other thing that's really important to me as a historian is that perhaps the chief moral lesson I gain from history, and I don't really think history is about learning moral lessons, but this is the moral lesson for me. I see myself. So whenever I find some 12th century Christian behaving badly, my first instinct is no longer, oh, how could they possibly have done that? My first instinct now is to think, wow, I wonder what people will say of me in my Reformed evangelical tribe today, 200 years from now. What is my blind spot? Because I am convinced we all have blind spots. I'm convinced that people will look back 200-300 years from now on us, on our culture, and wonder if we were really Christians. And the interesting thing is, secular culture will do the same about modern secularists today. They'll look back and go, "Oh, were they even moral?" Now, of course, if you were to ask me, what are the things 200 years from now people will see as our blind spots? My answer is, it's a blind spot. I don't know. All I know is that every era looks back on the era that it has supplanted, and looks down their noses at that era, and thanks God that I am not like them. But in fact, we are exactly like them. We are made of the same stuff. We have blind spots.
Yeah, that's so well said. I think it's N.T. Wright that has frequently said, I'm wrong about 20% of the things I say. I just don't know which 20% yet. And I think that's so true with that idea of like chronological snobbery, that we know better than them, and but now we've got it figured out. And I know just personally, I'm working on research on Catherine of Siena, reading her letters, and they ooze love of God, and then like so much stuff about the Crusades, and I'm sitting here thinking like, Catherine, how do you do this? But then it does make you pause and go, oh, they're going to say something about, they're going to look at my life and say, but you held these tensions. And of course, if I can find them, I want to get rid of them. But I think that should humble us before history, and that recognizing that this is probably going to happen to us too. And that doesn't give us a pass to not try to figure those things out, but it should I think, humble us in our approach to history. And that kind of gets to where I wanted to go next of, we look at these highs and lows, or as you put in your book, the bullies and saints, which I really enjoyed that title. So on the one hand, we want to avoid this chronological snobbery that looks at the past and just says, like, everything back then was bad. Like, of course, it's just been this evolution towards better things, and we have this kind of omniscient view where we can judge the past perfectly because we're more highly evolved. But on the other hand, and you mentioned this earlier, there's this kind of apologetic impulse to defend the past as Christians, that we take any criticism of the church at times and want to say, whoa, like that's an attack on the faith, and I have to jump to their defense. I have to have, I have to defend the Crusades, or I have to defend Martin Luther, or what have you. And so how do we balance that tension? And I think specifically for my audience who are vastly Christians, and they're committed to their faith. And when they hear these things, I think they get tense often. It's like, oh, they're coming at me with these things. That's my church. I love that church. And I love that they love the church. And I think they should. But how do we love the church in a way that doesn't kind of gloss over these difficulties, but allows real criticism?
Well, I think we need to see the whole church as family. And, families fight. Families see the foibles in each other and can talk about them and still sit down, hopefully, at the dinner table in the evening and care for one another. And so I see the ancient church and the medieval church and even the modern church as my family. And I can have arguments with every era of Christianity and sit down at the dinner table at the end of the day and have fellowship, knowing that they probably would have gripes against me. And so, a moment ago, we were talking about how each era in the future looks back on the past, but even that is probably misleading. I suspect a 12th century Christian would look upon modern materialistic evangelicalism in the US and Australia and wonder if we're Christians, just on the issue of wealth, right? We have not evolved on the issue of riches and charity. We have devolved. So when you begin to see the most heroic acts of the faith, not today, but in the let me think, 8th century, thinking of Alcuin of York, the 1100s. You think of some of the greatest mystics. You just continue to see heroes that are worth looking up to. And that enables me to be at peace with church history and to be at peace with my own period, since I'm not sure we're not in a dark ages today in church history. It's entirely possible that people would look on us as a dark ages. The way we look back on, say the Inquisitions or the Crusades as dark. The other thing is a theological thing to say. Jesus said the wheat and the weeds will grow up right alongside each other, and we're to expect that. So Jesus said to expect within the one church wheat and weeds. And then I read, say, 1 Corinthians, and I think of the problems going on in Corinth. People taking each other to court, mass dissension, not to mention the sexual immorality, that seems on a scale that's hard to fathom. And yet Paul calls them Christians. He addresses the church in Corinth as all Christians, as people who have experienced grace. So I take from that not to excuse to excuse their sin, but just to acknowledge the fallenness even of Christians who have believed the gospel and have the Holy Spirit, where works in progress.
Yeah, that is a great case study in the messiness of the church, I suppose you could say in a non-eloquent way. But I love that 1 Corinthians being, but also that picture of the wheat and the tares is perfect there, the wheat and the weeds there. I really appreciate that. And you mentioned that we see this in every period. And today I really want to hone in on one period because your book, I mean, it's masterful. It covers so much space that we couldn't possibly get it in an hour-long interview. And I want to kind of hone in on the patristic period for a couple of reasons. I think there's a huge revival of interest in it right now. And I also think that it's something, I mean, we've laid forth that we want to be people that claim all of church history. But I think for those that struggle, everyone wants to claim the patristic period, even if they are a little queasy over some later periods. I think we see this as so foundational. And also, I think this period is going to influence later periods. And also, people should just buy your book to read the rest of it. But starting with the patristic period, you start to lay out in your book this key theme that, at least for me, seems to come up throughout the book. And that's the relationship between Christians and power. And you do this by highlighting several key figures and movements in the history of the church. And of course, I really don't think you can have a conversation on church history and not bring up Constantine at some point. And you mentioned that perhaps sometimes we've overplayed his role, but at the same time, it's a role that is pivotal in some ways. So big question, but what do you see as the enduring legacy of the conversion of Constantine, for good and for ill? Because I appreciate that you show both in your book. Hey, we'll be right back to the interview, but first I want to tell you about another sponsor for today, and that is Faithful Counseling. Faithful Counseling is a group of Christian counselors that exist to help you get the help you need. You know, one of the first YouTube videos I ever made was called You Can Have Jesus and a Therapist Too. And what I wanted to do in that video was draw out the fact that so many people are struggling with mental health. And the last thing we want to do is make it more difficult for people to reach out to get the help they need by creating this stigma around it. It's something that I'm really passionate about and think we need to end in Christian circles. And that's why I'm so excited to be partnering with Faithful Counseling. Their counselors all will be counseling from a Christian perspective, and you can connect with them from any country in the world. They have counselors that speak many different languages. And hey, if it's important to you to have a counselor from your specific tradition or background, they can do their part to try to pair you up with one of them as well. All of their counselors are licensed with over 3,000 hours of experience. You can connect with these counselors in a variety of ways. In fact, you can do video sessions, phone calls, live chat, or messaging. All of the messaging is secure, and if it's between scheduled sessions, you'll receive a response within 24 to 48 hours. If this is interesting to you, if you think this would be helpful for you or maybe a loved one, I'd encourage you to go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity. If you do that, first of all, you'll get 10% off your order, and you will be matched with a counselor in less than 24 hours. Again, that's faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity to be matched with a counselor in less than 24 hours and get 10% off your first month. Faithful Counseling costs $260 per month, which gets you unlimited messaging with your counselor in 4 30-minute sessions. But again, if you go to faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity, you'll get 10% off that first month. Lastly, Faithful Counseling is not a crisis line. If you are currently experiencing suicidal thoughts or ideation, please reach out to a crisis line or hotline. You can find one of them at www.crisistextline.org. Please do so. You can reach out. You do not have to do this alone. Well, thank you all so much, and I will let you get back to the video. But if you want to check them out, again, faithfulcounseling.com/gospel simplicity. The link is in my bio and in the pinned comment. Well, back to the interview.
Yes, Emperor Constantine, and by the way, in the British Australian tradition, we pronounce it Constantine.
There you go.
Emperor Constantine is a really good case study, partly because so many myths have grown up about him, and I think maybe 10, 15 years ago was under that cliched impression that really when Constantine became a Christian, everything went bad because he gave Christians power, he forced Christianity on everyone, and that's where the church lost its real soul and its gospel focus. That simply isn't true, and the sources will not permit that. By the end of the 4th century, so a generation or two after Constantine, that's true. But Constantine at the beginning of the 4th century, no chance. What he did was he let Christianity be legal, fully legal. But he also allowed pagan religion to be legal. He didn't close temples and rip down statues and that sort of thing. His view in the Edict of Milan, a letter that he published throughout the empire, endorsed what we would call religious pluralism. Not at the theoretical level. He was adamant that Christianity was true. He'd come to believe Christianity was true. And I think he really did believe Christianity was true. I don't think it was a political thing. But he said that all people should follow their own will in the matters of religion. And that was a remarkable thing. But what he then did is he gave churches all of the same tax rights and legal rights that already pagan temples and Jewish synagogues and philosophical schools had. And what that meant is suddenly, with the tax breaks that came with that, the church became wealthy pretty quickly after Constantine, because they had a donor base that far exceeded the pagan temples and even the synagogues, let alone the philosophical societies. And people were, schooled in the tradition of Jesus to give their wealth to good. And so the church ended up inheriting land. People could leave their land to the church, and they could leave their land to synagogues too. But people did it on such a scale in Christianity, the church ended up owning a lot of land. But the church used those lands to start farms to grow food for the poor. That's how the church operated. Constantine did some terrible things. He encoded anti-Semitism. Had laws against Jews owning slaves, and Jews who tried to circumcise their slaves were to be executed. And there are some terrible things he did, thinking that he was following the way of Christ. On the other hand, Constantine gave everyone a weekend, a day off a week. Even the poor worker was allowed a day off a week. He modified punishments due to people. Instead of branding on the face, which was a very common Roman law for certain crimes, he insisted that we should never do that to any human being made in the image of God. They were to be branded on the thigh instead. And you might think, well, that's hardly an improvement. But if you were there in say 320 and you said, oh, you've done something very bad, we can either brand you in the face or brand you on the thigh. You're going for thigh for sure. He modified divorce and marriage law in favor of women, so that men who frivolously divorced their women were seriously punished. And Constantine changed the law so that women could go and take everything the man owned. Right? This was designed to sort of say you can't treat women like that. I mean, we could go on and on. There are lots of things he did that were humanitarian, and he was trying to encode some vision of Christianity in life, and he invited the church to advise him. But even still, in his period, people were not permitted to jump from the wealthy classes into church ministry. That was banned, and the churches loved that ban, because the church in this period was quite suspicious of the wealthy and powerful. So they didn't want the wealthy and powerful becoming priests, let alone bishops. And Constantine wrote that into law as well. So there were lots of things in this period, which is sort of 313 to 337, that are positive. And yet, of course, he was still a Roman emperor with hundreds of years of imperial policy to continue enforcing, and by our standards, brutally.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, like you say there at the very end, that he's a Roman emperor standing in this legacy of empire. And I think it's easy to be so critical of Constantine, like, you fused the church and power. But when you step into his shoes there for a second, and as you say, it seems he genuinely becomes a Christian, it's going to be hard to shake off the just cultural power and cultural conditioning of growing up in the Roman Empire and that whole ascendancy to power. And he really tried to do a lot of remarkable things. And I do want to hone in on one thing there that you mentioned, because I think for many people it's going to be the antithesis of the picture that they have of Constantine, or Constantine, shall I say, that, the church, I think there's a couple versions of maybe like typical Protestant history at the popular level that I think we're all recognizing are harmful. You mentioned it ended at Revelation and then Luther picked it up. Some people, you've got like a couple years and then it goes bad. Then for a lot, it's like, hey, Christianity was all right. Constantine came and, well, it got terrible. And they fuse that with, power, and the church gets rich and then everything goes poorly. But you mentioned this law, and I hadn't heard of it before reading your book, of barring powerful men from becoming priests. Can you speak into that a bit more? Because again, I think this is going to rub against the grain, and it's also going to kind of show that this didn't last when we talk about the next character, Ambrose of Milan. But why did they do this, and why was this important?
Well, they just had this bias against the powerful rich that sort of comes from the gospel. In the Gospels, Jesus is critiquing, the Gentiles lord it over each other. It's difficult for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God, and so on. So they had all these warnings in their head, and they had done so well without power and money in the 3 centuries, nearly 3 centuries leading up to Constantine. They were quite happy to go without it, and they were suspicious of the wealthy because already in the 3rd century, there's some evidence of the rich sort of waiting in the wings, sort of very attracted to the church, but they were barred from ministry, which was kind of cool because you got quite a few wealthy elites in churches, but they weren't allowed to lead the churches. How that must have messed with everyone's head about what is power. And Constantine just really endorsed this as a public law, as what we might call secular law, but it was already church law. Constantine's motives were also not just trying to endorse what was already a Christian pattern. Constantine didn't want the wealthy to escape public duties by going into the ministry. Because well-to-do people, sort of from middle class up, did have to offer public duties. It was a form of taxation where you might be called upon to be the mayor of a town for a year, or to give lodging to soldiers on your estates and feed soldiers, and everyone was required to do these public duties. And it presumably, we don't have good evidence of this, but presumably there were the rich were tempted to get out of those public duties by suddenly becoming a priest or going into the church and becoming a priest, because the church was exempt from all public duties. Constantine reasoned that the church was already doing too much good in society to bother them with these other public duties. So that was probably Constantine's motive, but it fitted with church law.
That's really interesting. And what a beautiful picture of someone who was initially outside the church. And of course, he's inside the church at this point, but saying, well, the church is just known for doing so much good. It's a bit of an intriguing idea that, unfortunately, I don't think for many people, when they think of the church today, whether they agree with the church or not, I think the goal would be that but the church is just such a beautiful presence that even if I don't believe like them, I love what they're doing. Unfortunately, I don't think we're there in many places, but I think maybe that could be an inspiring thing for us to think about there. But this idea of the powerful being barred from the upper echelons of the church doesn't exactly last, and church history tells a long story of power, money, and those things being abused within the church and being leveraged for the type of power that doesn't exemplify Jesus' kind of upside down kingdom that he preaches. And you point back to the Sermon on the Mount a lot as kind of this the central ethic of the Christian faith, and use that as something to kind of look at things against and see just how much dissonance there is at times. And one of the people you use for this is Ambrose of Milan. And a lot of people who listen to this channel might be familiar with him, but if you can give just a little bit of background on who he is, and then also why you chose him as a representative of what you called muscular Christianity. I don't think it has to do with his physique, but what is it that he represents, and what does that broadly show us about where the church is going on that trajectory?
So, a generation after Constantine, the church was quite nervous because Emperor Julian, the pagan, uh, unwound many of the legal blessings that Constantine had offered the church. Emperor Julian hated the church and really tried to marginalize it. And in his very short reign, he gave it a good whirl. All Christians were sacked from imperial service. All Christian academics were sacked from the great schools throughout the Roman Empire. And he sidelined them. And Christians woke up after the reign of Julian in 363 and thought, never again. Never can we allow that. I mean, imagine if the next emperor were just like Julian. If Julian had survived, humanly speaking here, if Julian had survived and not being killed on the battlefield, who knows what would have happened to Christianity? And so after the 360s, the church is thinking, we need to protect ourselves. We can't afford another emperor like that. And I think this was such a trauma. The church became a little more open to using muscle, lest another Julian take place. And this coincides with one of the truly gifted men of the late 4th century in Ambrose. He is a wealthy, the absolute elite of Roman society. He is fluent in Latin and Greek. He is highly educated. He is an orator. People love his public speaking. He is a Roman senator, full senator. He is, for a time, governor, right? A Roman governor, which is the highest status, the greatest power outside of, being the emperor or something. And he is invited to be Bishop of Milan, just like that. He hadn't been a reader in the church, which is sort of the lowest level, someone who can read out the gospel in church. He certainly hadn't been a deacon or a priest, and he's invited to be the bishop. And so he takes what must have been a pay cut, because in the late 4th century, still a majority of people aren't Christians. He takes a pay cut. He takes a social decline, a step down the ladder, and says, yes, I'll be bishop, because he was a very pious man. And he becomes the Bishop of Milan by popular appeal. And so instantly, all those laws about the wealthy and the elites going into church ministry are broken in one moment in the 370s. And the general public loves Ambrose. He is stylish. He is someone to look up to. He's at the top of the tree. He donates vast amounts of his own wealth to the church and to the poor. The lower classes adore him. They think of him as the champion of the poor. And he transforms the role of bishop from sort of chief protector of the apostolic deposit, which is how the bishops thought of themselves, to being mayor, the civic mayor of the town. And because he'd been a senator and a governor, he was just used to pushing people around, and he did as bishop. He sidelined the Arians, the heretics. He told pagans what to do. He forbade the use of churches for any of the imperial services. He interviewed and interrogated people suspected of funny ideas, heresy, like he was a governor interviewing criminals. He approved the burning down of synagogues, and we have clear evidence of this. And when the Emperor Theodosius asked Ambrose to support the repayment to the Jews of their synagogue, which had been burnt down by Christians, Ambrose said, "No way are we gonna, pay for that evil, temple to unbelief?" And he just refused the emperor. He got to the point where he was so loved and feared, he could tell the emperor what to do, and the emperor had to think twice about acting without Ambrose's approval. He demanded the bringing down of ancient pagan statues that stood in the Senate House in Rome. He was, I call him a bully, and that is perhaps unfair, and I say so in the book, that it's perhaps unfair to think of him as a bully. But if you were, say, a pagan elite in, let's say, 384, and we asked you what you thought of Ambrose of Milan, they'd say he's a bully and a scoundrel and a betrayer of all the Roman traditions. And if you were to ask a poor family on the outskirts of Milan, what do you think of Bishop Ambrose? They'd say, he is our champion. So here is this, it's the paradox of church history for me. In one man, you've got a bully and a saint, to put it in those colloquial terms.
Yeah, I found this case study super interesting because I pretty much knew Ambrose of Milan as the skilled rhetorician who inspired Augustine, or do you guys say you guys don't say Augustine, do you? I'm just trying to keep the pronunciation.
Augustine.
Okay, good.
Augustine.
Good. All right. But yeah, and I mean, I came across him in the Confessions, I think, first, and I've read some of his work, but never on kind of a deep historical level there. And especially the scene that you paint in your book of him going toe-to-toe with the emperor seems to just be something that would have been unimaginable to Christians 100 years prior to this, that a bishop would be telling the emperor what to do. And I think in scenes like that, we can see just how much has changed. And that's not to say that the church is completely bankrupt at this point, but it's to say that there have been incredible shifts in the place and power of the church. And I find it really interesting, and I appreciate you using him as a case study, and I learned a lot from it. In your book, you kind of shift geographically and to a different group after you go through Ambrose to kind of, again, not to necessarily pigeonhole Ambrose bad, these people good, but to show that there were different approaches and that there was some diversity at this time, staying in the 4th century when you look over at the Cappadocians and kind of contrast the muscular Christianity of Ambrose with the Cappadocian fathers. And they were talking about Gregory of Nyssa, Basil of Caesarea, and the other Gregory.
Gregory Nazianzus.
Yep.
Yeah.
There you go. Would you describe a bit about them and how they can help round out that picture of the 4th century to maybe not have people latch on only to Ambrose and then paint all of it based on Ambrose?
Yeah, so they're interesting because they're almost precisely the same period. Basil becomes a bishop in 374, which is roughly the same year as Ambrose becomes bishop. They're separated by a couple of thousand kilometers, and we think of rightly these Cappadocians as the greatest intellects, and they were. Basil went to the Great Academy of Athens. And yet his little brother Gregory of Nyssa eclipsed him in intellect. So these are the scholars who sort of cracked the nut of the Trinity, and they defended the Trinity philosophically, biblically, in a way that the Orthodox Church, and I mean that in its broader sense, not just the Eastern Orthodox. I mean, the Catholic and the Protestant and the Orthodoxy, that's still, their way of talking about the Trinity is still our way of talking about the Trinity. So that's what they're mostly remembered for, right? And if anyone did any theology, they know the Cappadocian Fathers only as the great Trinitarian exegetes and philosophers. However, they were highly active in social care. So, for example, Basil of Caesarea, Basil the Great, in addition to being a preacher, and scholar, established what we are pretty sure is the world's first public hospital. That is using the best of Greek medicine. Greeks have been doing pretty good medicine for a couple of hundred years before that, and employing a full nursing and physician staff to look after a massive complex that had 6 different departments. There was a department for the elderly. There was a department for abandoned infants, because this is still a period where Romans think nothing of leaving their children, especially girls, exposing them to get rid of them. And Christians would pick them up, and so he established this place for them, for the sick, for lepers, different departments in this whole. One writer calls it a city, right? So we're to think it was a giant medical facility that became so popular that by the 390s, there's one of these hospitals in Rome. By the 500s, they're over in Gaul. By the 900s, there are literally thousands of hospitals all throughout Christendom. In fact, it was one of the duties of a bishop to found a hospital in his diocese to look after the sick and poor. And it was entirely free. But that all comes from Basil. And so Basil is a great example of someone who used his power, such as it was. I mean, he wasn't an Ambrose in that sense, but he was a revered intellect. He was a scholar of scholars, but he used this for the betterment of society, for the service of society, instead of trying to boss people around. His younger brother Gregory, as I said, surpassed him in intellect. They still have philosophical conferences based on the writings of Gregory to this day. So an immense intellect, but he was also absolutely committed to the same projects, to caring for the poor, for hospital work. And he is our first recorded abolitionist, a full-blown abolitionist who didn't just do things to modify slavery. Like all the churches did things to modify slavery. They would try and purchase slaves and free them, right? That Christians were doing that from the beginning. But Gregory actually thundered against the very principle of slavery. And it was entirely based on the fact that every human being is made in the image of God. And you could not possibly purchase the image of God. For what price could you purchase the image of God, he says? What folly is slavery? Now, we can lament the fact that Gregory didn't become an Ambrose, or Gregory wasn't as influential as Ambrose, and imagine how history would have been different had the views of Gregory really taken off in the West. But they are good examples, the Cappadocians, of power, because they certainly had social power, used for the good of society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that in them we see this picture of theologians not just as towering intellects, but people who are deeply concerned with the well-being of their communities. And I think that's just a lesson for anyone interested in theology.
Yeah.
And I think people would do well to read not only their works on the Trinity, which are fantastic, but also Basil on poverty and Nissa
on the poor. His essay on the poor, which was a sermon, is perhaps the most articulate essay on charity for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And the logic, the scriptural basis for it is stunning. And it was incredibly influential right through to the time of Aquinas. 1,000 years later.
I dare any Christian in the West to read that and not start to wonder if that's a blind spot for us. And I say that not having risen above that with my AirPods in my ears and sitting where I am, but I would encourage people to look that up. There's one question I want to ask before we get to just some of the rapid fire closing questions, and that is around Augustine and his just war theory. Now, in your book, again, you hearken back to the Sermon on the Mount quite a bit, and where we have this I can't help but describe it as a nonviolent ethic of, if you're struck on the cheek, turn the other cheek, and love your enemies, and all of these things. And then just 400 years later, we have the most influential theologian in the Western tradition, probably of all time, giving us this theory of just war. And again, I think this, on one level, is just a picture of the position of the church. If we look at these things in a vacuum, it can be easy to ask, how did this happen? And I think we should ask, how does this happen? But again, the church is in a radically different place at this point. But could you describe a bit what this signals? And if you want as well, just briefly, what is his just war theory? But even more so, what does this show us about the place of the church by this time?
Again, this is one of those things that's so difficult to get across in an accurate, therefore nuanced way. It's a little bit like the story of Constantine. But in short, Augustine is in an era where there are a lot of Christians. So he's writing in the early 400s. And so we're probably safe to say there's a majority, slight majority of Christians. There's still a lot of pagans and a lot of pagans in government too. But there's enough Christians and enough Christians who are governors for it to be a live question. What do we do when tribesmen from Sahara come up to North Africa and raid the villages outside of Carthage and destroy property and kill men, women, and children? And Augustine is asked the question, well, here you are, you're the Bishop of Hippo in North Africa. What do I do? How do I be a Christian and stop these raids? And Augustine has to do some fancy thinking. Now, he is fully aware of the tradition of the Sermon on the Mount. He's not a sellout or anything like that. But he has to really think deeply about the use of violence to stop evil. And without at all, in his mind, compromising the Sermon on the Mount, the love of enemies, he reads the Apostle Paul in Romans 13 and sees that God has established secular rulers as servants of God to bear the sword, to punish evil and commend the good. And he reasons on this. So what if a Christian is now one of those secular rulers? Because that is the situation now. What do they do? And he comes to a very tentative, nervous, humble view that not as Christians, but as servants of God in the state, a Christian governor or emperor or general may conduct violence to stop evil and commend the good. This is not violence to extend the church, violence to convert people. He didn't believe in that. But to stop evil bloodshed, violence can be used. And he set out a whole bunch of principles which we can piece together from his wonderful work on the City of God and from his letters written through this period. And the principles are, it must be a response to evil. He rejected all of the normal Roman motivations for warfare, geographical expansion, honor, and so on. He hated all that. But he said to respond to evil, you may do it. It must be proportionate. That is, you must only use the force that is the right amount to stop the evil and no more. You should conduct the war or the violence in such a way that you don't leave the losers resentful. You must respect their humanity. Now, one could wonder, how could you ever conduct violence in a way that leaves people not resenting the victor? But these are the principles he laid out. And he said that even still, this doesn't make war holy. It just makes it a necessary evil that a just ruler must do and which we must all lament. So this is his approach. And I think he makes a good case, if I'm honest. The problem is, as the most influential thinker for the next 1,000 years on every every topic in the West, people see that he opened the door on justified violence. And so after St. Augustine, the next rulers say, oh, well, Augustine thought it was okay, without actually having read any of the 5 million words that Augustine wrote. And they just thought, Augustine said it was okay, so let's go and do it. And that's the problem. So as Christianity moves west and moves into Gaul and then up into Saxony, the justification of Augustine is modified, we might say even perverted, to justify expansionist projects. So by the time you get to the 8th century, you've got Charlemagne, Charles the Great, conquering the Saxons at the end of a sword, trying to convert them. Baptism or sword, right? And his justification, theologically, if pressed, would be right back to Augustine, even though Augustine would never have recognized that was an appropriate use of violence. And I must say, in the 8th century, there were Christians, at least one that we know of, who rebuked Charlemagne, a very risky thing to do to the greatest man in Europe, who rebuked him for his policy of trying to convert people with the sword and begged him to apply gentle teaching, following the apostles, gentle teaching, persuasion to lead the Saxons to baptism. That man is Alcuin of York. My chapter on him is the greatest European you've never heard of, and he is. He is.
Yeah, if you didn't bring that up, I was going to point people towards that, because it is a great. The book takes this very nicely from what Augustine intended to how that ended up being distorted later on. And I appreciate the nuance that you bring to that in such a condensed answer as well, which I know is not easy to do. And speaking of condensed answers, we're going to close out with a segment I call the Final Four here. And I just want to say I really appreciate your time today. I really appreciate this interview, and I'll be leaving links to all of your work, your podcast, the book, all those things in the description for people if they want to check out more. But I like to do these to kind of get our academic caps off just a bit, and let people see you a bit more as well. So first question, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
Without doubt, using the Book of Common Prayer, the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which is a Reformation document. Don't let anyone tell you it's not. For my private prayers, it lifts me so long as it's never rote. These are the best prayers ever written in English. And they lift my spiritual life immensely.
I love that. Outside the Bible, well, this might actually be the same thing then, but I'll ask for a different one if it is. Outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
Yeah, well, maybe the Book of Common Prayer, but no, leaving that aside, it's hard to reduce it to one, my friend. I'm gonna say two. One of them is one you would never have heard of. It's a wonderful 800-page history of Australian, European, and Christian engagement with Indigenous people, and now over a 200-year colony. And I read that in the late 90s, and I think it was my first glimpse of how the church could be beautiful in its treatment of Indigenous people and shockingly awful and racist. That book really rocked me and lifted me. And I'm going to throw in one other, the Journals of George Whitefield, where I discovered that you can be a traditional Anglican and a red hot public evangelist.
Yes, he is an interesting combo in those things, and yeah, that's really interesting as well. I would love to chase that down, but no time on the Christianity and colonization. That's a whole subject right there. But you're having coffee with your undergrad or early grad school self. What's one piece of advice you give him for his future in studying history and theology?
Probably study more philosophy, which I think I've realized too late that philosophy actually undergirds a lot of what we do in history and theology. And so I would have improved my philosophy. And I would have got better at more languages early on.
Oh, I appreciate that. I kind of asked that question selfishly as I get ready for grad school. I appreciate those answers.
Learn all the languages, my friend. That's learn all the languages.
I spent all summer doing Latin,
Yeah.
and working through a couple more, but I will work on it. Last question. This channel is called Gospel Simplicity, and it's often pointed out that the conversations can be a bit complex, and people have told me perhaps you should change the name to Gospel Complexity, to which I say I refuse. You're bringing simplicity out of some complexity, even if it isn't always simple. But if you could, in a sentence or a small paragraph, what is the gospel?
Well, this is something I've written about in other books. That's an easy one. The gospel is the message that ended up being written down in the Gospels, which is how come we call them Gospels? The ancient church wasn't idiots. So the people who wrote, the titles, the Gospel according to Mark, knew what the gospel was. It's the life, teaching, healings, death, resurrection, and return of Jesus for the salvation of the world. That is the gospel. What's in the Gospels?
That's a wonderfully simple answer. Dr. Dickson, I thank you so much for your time today. This has been a joy, and I thank everyone who listens to this sometime in the future. I don't take your time lightly. I'll close as I always do by saying until next time, be on the lookout for more videos, but most importantly, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world.